The Gettysburg Address. Within its text, President Abraham Lincoln uttered, "The world will little note nor long remember what we say here." The message lives on as perhaps the most memorable speeches delivered by a commander-in-chief. We discuss its significance on Newsmakers.
70 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live.
If you want to understand the meaning and context of the Gettysburg Address, this is your man.
I'm Fred Priebe. I'm a Lincoln presenter, and this is my wife Bonnie, who's a Mary Lincoln presenter. We visit schools and churches and libraries and any organization that wants to know more about the life and times of President and Mrs. Lincoln.
Fred and Bonnie live and breathe the essence of the nation's 16th President and First Lady, calling this log cabin home nestled in Belleville, Michigan, home. They've kindly invited us in for a conversation about Gettysburg and the address.
The Gettysburg Address, as a historian, you have been able to pore over this line by line. The importance of the text and what it means in big picture terms for all Americans.
Well, of course, Lincoln wanted to tell the people where we were going. In this speech, he tells where we've been, where we started from, and then he takes a section where he talks about where we are right now and what his vision is for the future. And it was, in a sense, quite radical because he's talking about equality. The Emancipation Proclamation, which was issued earlier, did not talk about equality. It talked about freedom. Now he's talking about equality. By the time the war is about over, when he makes that speech from the balcony and he's talking about citizenship for the black people and the vote, that was very radical. We can listen to that today and it just kind of goes this way because we're so used to it. But in his day, that statement was heard by a young actor by the name of John Wilkes Booth. And he said, supposedly, that's the last speech he'll ever make.
Is there an olive branch somewhere hidden in there for the Southerners who fought the Union?
That's a good question. The olive branch, if there is one, is in what's not there. Because in that speech, no town is mentioned, no armies mentioned, no specific officers mentioned, slavery itself isn't mentioned. He's talking about what he sees for the whole nation, and that includes everybody. So there's an implied olive branch where he's saying we all need to come together, to reunite, to make this a great nation once again, for people to be free. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground.
And when you walk down the streets, you're easily identifiable. And when you ask them about Gettysburg and the significance of that location, 1 out of 10 Americans understand?
In my experience, the majority of people that you would ask why was Lincoln at Gettysburg they don't know the reason. They'll say things like, well, he's there to make a speech. And so most of the time when we present the Gettysburg speech, we set the background. People come up to us afterwards often and say, I didn't know that. I didn't know that. Oh, I didn't know that. And so that then makes me feel like we've done our job, because we're educators. I taught school for 30 years. And so I still teach. And so I use this as a teaching moment.
Well, let's put it into context then, because that's the beauty and what makes the Gettysburg Address so spectacular, is the lead up to and what happens after.
You got 75,000 rebel forces moving into southern Pennsylvania, and then 90,000 Union forces come in, and they clash for 3 days at Gettysburg, and it's hot. Some of the reports that came back said the temperature was in the 90s, and it was just hot, sunny days. And they're in their wool uniforms, you know. And they'd been marching for days. They were hungry, they were thirsty, and now they're trying to do battle, climbing hills and over rocks and all this kind of thing. And after 3 days of battling, over 50,000 casualties. And some reports said you could walk across a farmer's field and not touch the ground because there were so many bodies. Well, of course, with the heat, something had to be done quickly with those bodies. And because they were starting to deteriorate and all of that. So in many cases, large shallow graves were dug and the bodies thrown in, and some makeshift markers were put there to identify it was this unit or that unit or what have you. And of course, I like to say in government, when we're not sure what to do, we form a committee. And so the governor of Pennsylvania established one, and it was decided, after looking at the whole situation, it was going to cost a lot of money to send those bodies back home. So they bought land on Cemetery Hill, right next to the cemetery that was there, and was going to make that a national cemetery. And well, then they let bids to see who was going to get the job. The high bid was $8 per body. The winning bid was $1.59. Well, then the committee thought, we need to dedicate this place. And almost unanimously, they wanted Edward Everett as the main speaker, because he was probably the best known orator in the country. And they had set the dedication for October 23rd. And they were asking him around middle September, and he said, I need more time. And so he wanted to push it back to November 19th, and they reluctantly did so because they wanted him, but it was reluctant because by mid-November, you don't know what the weather's going to be like. But they wanted him, so they said, okay.
The lead up to the address and the penning of the words, take me through the process from the president's perspective.
Yeah, well, he got the invitation to go to the ceremony around November 3rd, 4th, somewhere there. And in the letter, it states that after the main oration, we would like for you to make a few appropriate remarks dedicating the cemetery for its sacred purpose. Well, that let him know that he was not to make a major speech. That was Everett's job. His job was just to make a few statements. And part of the reason for that was because Lincoln's reputation as a speaker was sort of backwoods-ish. And this was a solemn occasion. And they didn't want him to make it something less than what it was supposed to be. So they were reluctant to some extent to even ask him to speak. Well, of course, as it turned out, it was different. He made the decision to go on Monday the 16th. And Lincoln notes when they get off to the train, on the train platform, there's stacks of empty coffins. So, that hits him right there, that scene. Here's these empty coffins, so the job's not done yet. And he had other things on his mind, because meanwhile, Tad had become sick. And Mary really would have liked Abe to stay home, because they had just lost Willie last year. And but he was determined to go. So he gets a telegraph message from Stanton that evening with a message from Mrs. Lincoln that Tad's fever broke. So he didn't have to worry about that. So he finishes writing the speech that night, and they get to the ceremony then, and Edward Everett is a half hour late. Ceremony begins, and the chaplain of the Senate gives the opening prayer, and it's quite lengthy. And then Everett speaks, and he speaks for nearly 2 hours. Now, in our day, that's a long time. Even if you're sitting in theater seats, watching a film today that's 2 hours long is sometimes difficult. And here these people are standing outdoors and listening to a 2-hour speech, but that was normal. And then Lincoln was introduced, and he got up and spoke. And when he sat down, a lot of people were shocked, because they said, "That's it?" Because it was only 2.5 minutes or so. And then Lincoln goes home that evening, and he wasn't feeling well. That was another reason why Mary wanted him to stay home, because he wasn't feeling well. It turns out he has varioloid, which is a mild form of smallpox, and he was in bed for 3 weeks after that. But the next day, he gets a letter from Edward Everett complimenting him on the speech. Everett said something to the effect, "I should flatter myself if I came as near to the point in 2 hours as you did in two minutes." And then he goes on to ask him for a copy of the speech. And Lincoln was ecstatic, because he greatly admired Everett, because Everett was a great speaker. And to get that kind of a compliment from this guy, I mean, he was just really, really pleased. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor powers to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here.
You have recited the Gettysburg Address. How many times do you think?
Oh my goodness, how many times? Hundreds. When we started doing this, in 1996, my dear wife said to me, if you're going to do Lincoln, what is his signature thing? The Gettysburg Address. So if you're going to do Lincoln, you have to be the best at doing that speech. Otherwise, why bother? I said, okay. So what we did is we sat down and we looked at the speech, line by line, word by word. And of course, there are no recordings of Lincoln making the speech, because that hadn't been invented yet. So we could only guess which words he put emphasis on, where he put the pauses and so on. So we just read over the speech over and over, and came to realize that he used a lot of pronouns. So we figured that he probably put emphasis on those pronouns. For example, the second, now we are engaged in a great civil war. So we believe that he put emphasis on the pronouns rather than the nouns. And so then we practiced the speech and how it sounded. We recorded it and played it back and tweaked and practiced and finally got it down to where we had a general presentation of it. I have to say, though, that every time I recite that speech, it's different, because I have a different audience, I feel different, I may be tired, or I may be energetic, or I may be hungry, I may be overstuffed, whatever it is, So my mood might be different. And the challenge is, for me, because, as you say, I've said it many times, to make it sound fresh. Because the audience, even though the audience isn't really hearing it for the first time, because most of them memorized it when they were in school and they've heard other people say it, but not many people have heard a Lincoln presenter say it. And so they want to hear it from a Lincoln presenter in a way that they think Lincoln would have said it. And so that's a real challenge. So it has to sound like it's being spoken for the first time. So that's the challenge I have every time, is to make it sound fresh. It is for us, the living rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced.
Why is it important for school kids of today, whether they're K through 12, even college, why is it important for people to know it, recite it?
Well, the message that Lincoln had in that speech for his audience is the same today. We're still talking about equality, whether it's black-white or male-female or whatever it is. Those issues are still here in different forms, but even the issues they had in 1863 have not been totally resolved. We've come a long way, but we're still working on them. And so we need, I think, that our young people coming up today need to understand that this is a problem that's been around a long time, and we're still working on it, and people have worked on it for 150 years. And we're making progress, but we have to keep going.
You've been a teacher all of your life. When did you know that this would be the persona that you would take on?
Oh, well, Lincoln was always my favorite president. I can remember back in elementary school when we actually celebrated Washington's birthday and Lincoln's birthday, and we'd decorate the classroom with their pictures and so on, and I was always drawn to Lincoln. I don't know why, but I was. And over the years, you buy a book here, you buy a book there, and you read it, and you develop a base knowledge. Well, then I started working summers and the weekends at the Eagle Tavern in Greenfield Village, and I was doing role playing there. Then I'm working the porch of the Eagle Tavern this one day, and a Civil War reenactor came by, and she was watching me. And she told me later she had been watching me for about a half hour. And she came to me and she said, "You really need to do a Lincoln impression." And we talked about why and everything. And while we checked into it, we went to some Civil War weekend events and watched other Lincoln presenters and decided this was something we could do. And that was the fall of 1995. So then the next year, we said, well, we'll try this for 1 year and see what happens. So in 1996, we visited a few schools and went to a couple of Civil War weekends, and then my wife contacted the local newspaper. And she came out and took some pictures and wrote a story. Well, then a couple other newspapers picked that up, and the phone started ringing, and here we are, 2014, and it's my primary job now. There's a lot of study. You read constantly. You're always, it's like going to college and never graduating, because you're always studying, always reading. And you know how it is. When you don't use something, you lose it. When we do presentations, they're generally 45 minutes long. We know so much more. But if you don't get to use it in the question time afterwards, if you don't keep reading to keep it up here, then it gets lost. And we don't want that to happen, because we don't want to have it happen when we go to do a presentation and somebody asks a question that we should be able to answer but can't. So far we've been blessed, and that hasn't happened. But
there is a connection with Ken Burns' documentary, The Address, and the setting at an all-boys school, mainly to help young boys with speech impediments.
There are some challenges you'll never forget. For these boys, their challenge is the Gettysburg Address.
There are different diagnoses like dyslexia, like ADHD. So much focus has been on what they're not good at, that they don't realize what they're good at.
This is one of the most famous speeches of all time. It still means a lot.
From Ken Burns, The Address.
And I find out that this is something you have tackled, and having the Gettysburg Address be this instrument to perform and to overcome some barriers.
yeah. Yes, I developed a stuttering problem in early elementary school, and it kept getting worse. By the time I was in 8th grade, I couldn't say 3 words in a row without stuttering. I went to a 2-room country grade school. My 8th grade teacher said, "You're going to have a problem." She told my parents about a speech clinic in Madison, Wisconsin, which is something every 8th grader wants to do, you know, is to go to a speech clinic for 6 weeks. And so I went there, and it helped. I went to high school and got through it fine, and then when I decided to go to college, I wanted to be a teacher, and my father about died. He just was so afraid that my stuttering problem was going to surface and that my students would just chew me up and spit me out. But I taught school for actually 29 years at the junior high level, which is a real tough age. But I got through it. The problem is still there, especially when I'm tired or if I'm hungry. It comes back. But so far, it hasn't been a problem, at least not that anybody's told me.
For you, as somebody who has recited the Gettysburg Address so many times, who has a stuttering problem, and to know the storyline of the address and how these young men and these boys at the school in Vermont have used the Gettysburg Address to overcome their impediments and to build that self-confidence.
That's really special, because that speech has a sentence structure that is common to the 1860s. Some of those sentences are difficult to memorize and to say today because they're oddly worded in modern day English. Yes, it gives you some self-confidence, and for these kids to be able to do that, having gone through it myself, that's a great thing. And it's wonderful that that school's doing that.
Do you have a message for those young boys?
I would say don't give up. Don't give up. I tell the story of Lizzie Keckley, who was a slave, and she worked to buy her freedom. And it took her a long time to do it. She faced a lot of obstacles, and she could have given up so many times, and she didn't. And she finally got her freedom. She opened up her own sewing shop and became a very successful seamstress. And if she can do it, these kids can do it too. They can, you know, so just keep on keeping on.
President Abraham Lincoln,
working.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead, we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain. That this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth.